There are moments in history when the dead speak louder than the living, not through words, but through bones, scars, and stories buried beneath centuries of myth. This is one of those moments. Have you ever wondered how a spine could alter the course of history? How one man's physical deformity became a symbol for cruelty, ambition, and villainy? This isn't just a tale of a medieval king. It's the story of Richard III, a monarch twisted not just in form, but, some say, in heart. But was he truly the monster Shakespeare painted him to be? Or was he simply a man born into a world of war and betrayal, crushed under the weight of legacy, rumors, and a misshapen back? This is more than a tale of one man. It's a deep dive into the brutal world of 15th century England, where power was everything and loyalty was more fragile than parchment in a fire. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like and comment. Richard Plantagenet was born into a world already unraveling. It was the autumn of 1452. England was not yet at peace. The air was thick with tension, the kind that hums just before a storm breaks. The Wars of the Roses had not yet begun in earnest, but the seeds of civil war had already taken root. Richard's father, the Duke of York, harbored a dangerous ambition: to wrest the crown from the ineffectual King Henry VI. From the beginning, Richard's life was overshadowed by chaos. His family belonged to the House of York, one of two rival factions vying for the English crown. The other was the House of Lancaster. These were not simple political rivalries. They were blood feuds. Families were torn apart. Brothers betrayed brothers. Castles were sieged. Fields soaked in crimson. Richard was the 11th child. A boy of noble birth and great expectations, but few predicted he would ever rule. From the start, Richard's life was marred by death and disinheritance. His father was killed in battle when Richard was only 8 years old. Soon after, his elder brother Edmund was slaughtered. Their heads were displayed on spikes above Micklegate Bar in York, a chilling welcome for any child returning home. Imagine the trauma. A young boy, fleeing from his enemies, carrying the weight of a murdered family and a nation in collapse. It's no wonder that Richard grew up with steel in his spine, even if that spine was physically bent. It was in this violent environment that young Richard was raised. And though we now know he suffered from a condition known as scoliosis, which caused a curvature of the spine, there is no evidence that he was crippled in youth. In fact, records suggest he was an active, intelligent, and sharp-minded child. His youth was spent in noble households, including the Warwick household, where he was trained in the arts of war, chivalry, and governance. He was also tutored in Latin, law, and religious doctrine. These were essential for a boy who might one day govern lands or lead men into battle. Still, his body was marked. The scoliosis wasn't visible in portraits. Those were, after all, propaganda, but his skeleton uncovered in 2012 beneath a Leicester car park revealed the truth. Richard had a twisted spine. His right shoulder was likely higher than his left. His ribs compressed. His torso may have appeared shorter than it was. But make no mistake, this was not a man who limped or lay bedridden. He wore armor. He rode horses. He fought battles. But in the eyes of a superstitious medieval society, a physical deformity was more than a medical issue. It was a mark of divine judgment, a signal that something inside was just as twisted as what lay outside. And in Richard's case, that perception would shape the rest of his life. To understand Richard, we must understand the age he lived in. The Wars of the Roses were more than a series of battles. They were a fight for England's soul. The throne changed hands more than once. Trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal was the currency of power. Richard's older brother Edward seized the throne in 1461, becoming King Edward IV. Suddenly, Richard was no longer a nobleman's son. He was the brother of a king. At just 9 years old, He was given the title Duke of Gloucester and tasked with helping secure the Yorkist grip on the realm. But things were not simple. Edward's reign was marred by internal strife. The powerful Earl of Warwick, once Edward's greatest ally, turned on him. Richard stood loyal to his brother. He joined him in exile, followed him into battle, and fought fiercely in the decisive Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, where the Lancastrians were crushed and their prince, young Edward of Westminster, was killed. Richard was just 18, but he was already a battle-hardened commander. He rode in armor. He sat in courts. He punished rebels and protected widows. While the royal court in London was infamous for its greed and decadence, Richard's northern domain was governed with surprising fairness. Even his enemies noted that commoners spoke well of him, an unusual thing for a nobleman of the day. After the battle, rumors of Richard's ruthlessness began to spread. It was whispered he executed prisoners personally, that he relished war, that he had no mercy. But is that true? Or was it merely survival? In 1472, Richard married Anne Neville, daughter of Warwick, the very man who once rebelled against Edward IV. Through her, Richard secured a portion of the Warwick inheritance and strengthened his hold in the north of England. For the next decade, Richard served as Lord of the North, essentially a king in his own domain. He brought order to unruly regions, enforced justice, and gained a reputation for fairness among the common folk. While the court in London was rife with corruption and intrigue, Richard's north was relatively peaceful. And yet, beneath the calm, England simmered. Edward IV court grew corrupt, dominated by the ambitious Woodville family, relatives of the Queen. Their rise bred resentment. Tensions crackled like dry tinder. Then, as always in Richard's life, death struck again. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. His son, Edward V, was only 12 years old, a child king. Immediately, a power vacuum emerged. Edward IV's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, tried to protect her son's claim by surrounding him with her ambitious family, the Woodvilles. But Richard, named Lord Protector in Edward IV's will, moved swiftly. He intercepted the young king on his way to London and placed him in the Tower of London, ostensibly for his protection. Days later, Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, joined him. Then came the bombshell. Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, that their children were illegitimate. Parliament passed the Titulus Regius, legally disinheriting the boys. And on July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III. But the boys? They never left the tower. At first, they were seen playing in the gardens. Then less frequently. Then not at all. Their disappearance remains one of history's most chilling mysteries. Were they murdered? If so, by whom? Some point to Richard, who certainly stood to benefit. Others accuse the Duke of Buckingham or even Henry Tudor. By late summer, rumors spread like wildfire. The princes were dead, smothered, poisoned, vanished, and Richard, the new king, was the prime suspect. Did he do it? To this day, we don't know. There is no direct evidence. But his silence spoke volumes. What we do know is this: Richard never publicly explained what happened to the boys. He never produced them to dispel the rumors. And in a superstitious age, silence is often seen as guilt. Regardless of the truth, the stain stuck. A whisper turned into a rumor into a story into a legend. Richard, the man with the twisted spine, had murdered 2 innocent boys, his own nephews, to steal the crown. Shakespeare, writing under Queen Elizabeth, the granddaughter of Richard's enemy Henry VII, turned that silence into a scream. His Richard was a twisted devil, slithering through shadows, murdering with a grin. And that image stuck. It was the beginning of the end. Richard's rule was built on shaky ground. His reign began with a coup, and from that moment, rebellion was always a heartbeat away. One of the first threats came from the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, now his enemy. Buckingham turned on the king and raised an army, allying himself with none other than Henry Tudor, a Lancaster exiled in Brittany. Their plan: to depose Richard and restore the Lancastrian line. But fate and flooding delayed the invasion. Buckingham was captured and executed. Henry Tudor retreated. For a time, it seemed Richard was secure. Yet his grip was slipping. Tragedy struck in 1484 when his only legitimate son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died. The boy was just 10. He had been sickly, but his death left Richard devastated. With no clear heir, his dynasty teetered. That same year, Queen and Richard's wife fell ill. Rumors abounded that Richard would marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. Whether true or not, the whispers eroded his support further, and died in March 1485. By then, Henry Tudor had raised a new army and was sailing for England. The final confrontation was near. The Battle of Bosworth Field, August 22, 1485. Richard commanded a force of about 10,000 men. Henry Tudor's army was half that. Yet Richard had a fatal weakness: betrayal. Two of his most powerful allies, Lord Stanley and Sir William Stanley, held back their troops during the battle. Stanley, it must be remembered, was Henry's stepfather, and loyalty in war is always a gamble. Richard saw Henry across the battlefield. He made a decision that would define him for eternity. He mounted his charger and led a cavalry charge straight at Henry. Cutting through enemy lines, he came within feet of striking the killing blow. But the Stanleys turned on him. Surrounded, Richard fought like a lion. Eyewitnesses said he slew several men before falling. When his helmet was knocked off, his skull was exposed. A grievous wound later confirmed by forensic study. Another blade struck his pelvis. Others stabbed his back. His body was mutilated post-mortem, his armor stripped, his corpse thrown over a horse, displayed in Leicester like a trophy. Henry Tudor was crowned king on the battlefield, the first of the Tudor dynasty. And Richard, his name was cursed. In 1592, more than a century after his death, Richard III stepped onto the stage. Not as a king, but as a monster. William Shakespeare's Richard III is perhaps the most damaging piece of historical fiction ever written. Hunched, deformed, malevolent, scheming, this Richard is pure villainy. A man who smiles while stabbing backs, who slaughters children with cold delight, who woos a grieving widow over her dead husband's body. Brilliantly written, dramatically compelling, utterly ruthless, and almost certainly false. Shakespeare was writing under Queen Elizabeth I, granddaughter of Henry VII, the man who killed Richard. Demonizing Richard wasn't just good theater, it was politically convenient. But the image stuck. Centuries of schoolchildren grew up seeing Richard as the embodiment of tyranny. Yet historical records show a more complex figure. A man who promoted legal reforms, who was loyal to his brother, who ruled effectively in the North, and who may have been the victim of political propaganda. For over 500 years, Richard's body was lost. Then, in 2012, archaeologists from the University of Leicester announced an astonishing discovery. Beneath a council car park, they found a skeleton. DNA tests confirmed it was Richard III. The spine was unmistakably curved, a classic case of scoliosis. But the bones told another story too. This was not a feeble man. He had no sign of a withered arm, as Shakespeare claimed. His injuries were consistent with battle, and the location of the wounds on his skull and buttocks suggested humiliation. His enemies had not just killed him, they had butchered him. In 2015, Richard was reburied in Leicester Cathedral with dignity and ceremony, a king once again. But even today, the debate rages on. Was Richard a noble king maligned by Tudor propaganda, or a ruthless usurper whose ambition knew no bounds? Richard III remains one of history's great enigmas. Was he crooked in spine, and nothing more? Or did that curvature reflect a deeper bent toward ambition, betrayal, and bloodshed? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. He was a product of his time, a world where power was earned on the battlefield, where murder was a political tool, and where a king's deformity could be turned into a symbol of evil. But one thing is certain: Richard's legacy was written not by himself, but by his enemies. And it took 5 centuries, a parking lot, and modern science to give him back his voice. So now that you've heard the story, the real, tangled, suspenseful saga of Richard III, what do you believe? Was he England's last true warrior king, or the villain Shakespeare warned us about? Share your thoughts below in the comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history that doesn't just inform, it haunts.